The crisis that we're studying is getting worse and worse and worse. And I hope that even if it risks depressing you, that you take some time now in this semester to pay a bit more attention to financial news than you might have done anyway. Because it'll help clarify what we're doing in the class. It'll suggest questions to you. It'll pique your interest perhaps in ways that it didn't before. But truly remarkable things are happening. This last week, just to give you an example, the World Bank issued a report, a very important report, in which it begins to sound the alarm about the effects in the third world, the whole world, but particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, of the downturn as it spreads from the United States globally, and the weakness of many of these economies puts them in a very vulnerable position to handle the effects. Another piece of information coming out is that the a number of the Eastern European countries are in extreme difficulty. They basically borrowed huge sums of money, usually in two currencies, the euro and the Swiss franc. And as their economies get into trouble and their currency suffers, they are stuck with having to pay loans that keep costing them more and more because it takes more and more of their currency to buy a Swiss franc or to buy a euro. And so as their economies get into worse shape, their debts become larger. It's the worst of all possible worlds. And there's serious question whether there will not now be shortly a default of a country or several. And not only in Eastern Europe, but that's particularly acute there right now. And that, lastly, that one of the phenomena driving all of this, and you should appreciate the ironies of a system when it begins to break down. This is the kind of contradictory absurdity that comes to the fore. It's partly a sign that the situation is serious, is that the Bush administration, the Obama administration, in trying to borrow the money, we talked about that last time, to pay for the stimulus, is drawing loanable funds from all over the world here. So that if the effort made by the Czech government or the Polish government or any one of dozens of other governments needing to borrow to get through a hard time cannot, that all the money that they might have otherwise accessed, that they weren't able to access before, isn't available. Because any lender comparing, let's see, I could lend my money to the Polish government or to the American government, that is a no-brainer. The Polish government's much too vulnerable, much too shaky in comparison. The Polish government can fall and you're okay. If the American government falls, it's over anyway, and money is no longer your problem. Your problem isn't money, your problem is running very quickly and figuring out in what direction. Yes?
Where does the IMF and World Bank stand on this? Where do they get their money from? I mean, these are the institutions that are supposed to give these countries
help.
Loans if a situation like this comes.
They're in the same situation as we're going to go through now with banks and insurance companies, which is they were designed and they were given money. Basically, they get contributions from member governments. That's how they get the money, most of it. They were designed to handle small problems, temporary problems, particularly the IMF. Remember, the IMF is supposed to handle a short-term difficulty that a government gets into. The World Bank is a different thing. It's supposed to help in long-term economic development projects. So keep a sense, at least they're supposed to be. They sometimes stray into each other's area, but that's the idea. To answer your question simply, they don't have enough money. They can't handle a problem that is much larger than anyone foresaw. So in order for the IMF to make a kind of difference now, it would need a vast new influx of money from the member governments. They'd all have to kick in huge amounts of money just at the time when they don't have that kind of money to do that. They're busy trying to save themselves, and so they're not in a position to get, they may have to. It becomes also political in Eastern Europe. Come on in. It becomes political in Eastern Europe, for example. A number of the Eastern European governments would like to borrow money from the one country in Europe that's in a position to lend it to them so far, which is the German government, which is by far the strongest economy. It was already before the disasters of this current crisis, but they're becoming even more relatively strong because the Germans are not as in bad trouble as most of the other countries of Europe. Germans were traumatized the last time these sorts of things happened. The Germans, remember, I think I told you, but if not again, right? Germany loses World War I. It's the end of the Kaiser, of the old empire of the Germans. Suddenly, this whole empire collapses, and they are taken over internally by the collapse and loss of World War I. They get rid of the Kaiser, and the socialists take over. The 1920s is a socialist period of government in Germany, very moderate socialist, but it was socialist. And the disaster of World War I was barely over, with the German population having to try to understand that there was no more Kaiser, that the government was now in the hands of people who were socialists, who not only didn't like the Kaiser and didn't like the empire and didn't like the old landed feudal aristocrats of the eastern part of agrarian part of Germany, but they didn't much like capitalism either. They were in favor of workers. That's a lot to ask a population to go through. Losing a world war, which you had gloriously entered sure you were going to win, and then to be governed by socialists with a whole new agenda that they were all excited about. A small matter. These socialists also included a disproportionate number of German Jews. Since you all know what happens in Germany later, this is not an unimportant fact. The Jews made it up into the top parts of German society, in part by their role in the trade unions, in intellectual circles, and in the Socialist Party, which was a very large party. Very different, say, from Russia in 1917, where the Socialist Party that takes over is a very small party, where the mass of people have nothing to do with socialism. That's not the case in Germany. When the German socialists take over, they are the second biggest party in Germany. So that's a mass organization that has deep roots in Germany, been going for many, many decades and building up its strength. So it takes over. It's a very different sort of phenomena, but nonetheless it's difficult for the Germans. Then in the 1920s, a bare 3-4 years after the war is over, 5 years after the war is over, the German economy suffers another shock. They have one of the greatest inflations in the history of the world. In a period of 7 months, the currency, the value of the German mark, as it's called, the Deutschmark at that time, goes from, I think, 8 to the dollar to 4 trillion to the dollar. That's an inflation. Prices, my mother was a young woman in Germany. My mother was born in Germany, and she was a young woman. And she remembers her father being paid twice a day at his job, being paid a bag, what we would nowadays call, think of a brown grocery bag that you get at a grocery store, full of money. And he would run home and give it to her mother, my grandmother, the bag of money, and she would run. I mean it, not walk, run, because my mother, a little girl, kind of watched this bizarre behavior, and she would run to the store to buy things with the bundle of money, because if she waited till that evening, it wouldn't be worth anything anymore. So she could get a bag of groceries with the half day's pay at lunch. By dinner, she couldn't get, she could get 2 potato chips out of the bag for that amount of money. And the prices were rising many times per day. They would be doubling and tripling across each hour. Okay. What this did in Germany was couple the trauma of the end of the Kaiser, of the loss of a world war, of the opprobrium of the world as having caused the war. For those of you who don't know, World War I was the most violent, destructive war that Europe had ever seen. In many ways, it is still now the most violent war that we have record of in terms sheer of destruction of people, of animals, of countryside. What this inflation did was wipe out 3 generations of savings. Germans are very frugal people. They save money. They don't invest it. They don't buy stocks or bonds. They put it in a mattress. It was at that time very difficult even to get them to put it in banks because they didn't trust the banks, which turned out to be very smart on their part. And so the bourgeois family, the middle-class German burgher family, had money saved. That money became worthless. 3 generations of savings accumulated that had been very valuable ended up being worth, over a period of a month, enough to buy a quarter pound of butter. So now they lost their empire, lost the war, were governed by socialists, and had been wiped out financially. They had nothing. They had nothing at a time when jobs were very shaky. 5 years later, the inflation rises and falls very quickly, 1922, 1923. In 1929, 6 years later, the Great Depression hits, and they lose their jobs. They have no more savings. The country is a wreck. It is a psychological wreck. Everything that it had, it lost. Everything that little middle class had accumulated had been taken from it. It was ripe and ready to find somebody to be very, very angry at for all that had happened to them. Socialists, communists, Jews, good group. All you needed was somebody to mobilize mass upset in that direction. Arrives, very interesting, a great celebrator of tall, blonde, blue-eyed Germans. Who was he? A small, short, dark-haired Austrian. But that's what Hitler was. But the power of the problem meant, who cares? It's a little bit like when Reagan became president of the United States and began his song and dance about family values. This man had been divorced twice, had a history of bed hopping that rivaled that of any other actor around. The only difference was he wasn't a good actor. He may have been good in that other activity, I don't know, but yet it didn't make any difference. People wanted to believe in all of this stuff, so that was fine. You forgot about that.